Hey, it's Matt, your average gamer, and for the end of the week here, I wanted to finish off the entire week of Faith with the 7 best Faith builds on patch 1.09, at least the most powerful ones I used. I'm going to share each one with you, and we're going to start here with the one we just did yesterday, and that's the Blasphemous Blade, which is incredibly powerful and can be buffed like crazy. The Blasphemous Blade is also number 1 on this list because not only is it insanely powerful, you get HP back by using its weapon skill as well. It's ridiculously overpowered. Let's get into equipment. This is the incredibly buffed up version, and for this one we had the Blasphemous Blade plus 10, the Giant Seal, Black Dumpling and Mushroom Crown, Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Kindred of Rot's Exaltation, Fire Scorpion Charm, and then we had the Fire tier as well. You use something like the Defense tier or the Faith tier. Let's get into stats. For stats at 150, this is something where you're just going to invest as much as you can in Faith. You pretty much, if you're using the Ash of War, can go for the minimum as far as strength goes and just highly invest in Faith. The more Faith you have, the more damage you're going to get out of Taker's Flame, which is the weapon skill, and it's incredibly powerful to combine that with buffs and the fact that, again, the weapon skill basically scales solely off of one stat, and that's your Faith stat. Next up on this list is another incredibly powerful one, and that is Black Flame Tornado. I did a build on this past week, and it's absolutely fantastic for damage. Black Flame Tornado in general is something that's incredibly powerful, especially if you're able to use the fully charged version of it. It isn't boosted by the Godfrey icon, but the fire damage to percentage damage, it's just insane how much damage you can get out of it. And then we're using the Grave Scythe as well. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Grave Scythe, as we mentioned, with Black Flame Tornado on it, 2 Godslayer Seal to give us a 30% boost. We had the Black Flame Monk set on, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Fire Scorpion Charm, Shard of Alexander. We have the Ritual Swords Talisman, and then of course the Fire tier. Then you can use something like the Faith tier or the Defense tier as well, and you're going to get a lot of damage out of this one. Let's get into stats. So for stats here, this is very much like the first one. Your Faith stat is going to scale entirely with the Ash of War on this one. So the higher the Faith you have, the more damage you're going to get out of it. And then we went with Flame Art on the Scythe to give us maximum damage and to basically invest solely in more or less one stat. The minimum requirements on the weapon, but then high Faith to get high damage out of that Ash of War. So get your Faith as high as possible for this one, and for this next one, it's also going to be centric around Black Flame because we're going to be talking about one of my favorite weapons in the entire game, and that is the Godslayer's Greatsword. The Godslayer's Greatsword is a Dex and Faith weapon, and it's one of the most powerful in the game because of the Queen's Black Flame weapon skill. Now, the weapon skill itself does percentage damage, has insane hyper armor, and can chew through boss HP. So everything that combines on the Ash of War, because the Ash of War has that percentage damage, that fire damage, and as I mentioned, awesome hyper armor, it turns into something that can literally destroy bosses, and when you're able to pull off that weapon skill, if you time it right, it really does just chew through their HP, as I mentioned, and it does ridiculous damage. This is one of those weapons, if you haven't used it yet, be sure to pick up the Godslayer's Greatsword. It is no doubt one of the best in the game. I enjoy this weapon a ton, as I mentioned, and it's something that you definitely got to try. Now let's get into equipment for this awesome build. For equipment, we have the Godslayer's Greatsword plus 10, we have the Godslayer's Seal plus 25, we have the Black Flame Monk set on, we have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Fire Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, and then you're going to want the Fire tier, and then something like the Faith tier or the Defense tier. Let's get into stats for this build. For stats on this one, it's split on the Ash of War. It's split pretty much evenly between Dexterity and Faith, so you're going to want to get as much Dexterity and Faith as you possibly can. At 150, I was able to get a reasonable amount of damage with these stats. I think they were pretty fitting, and then you're going to want probably a minimum of 50 Vigor. It does have good hyper armor, but you could end up trading hits some with the weapon skill because it's just one of those ones that does take a little bit of time. It is on the lengthy side as far as the weapon skill, but it does massive damage and it's a ton of fun to use. Speaking of fun, the next one up is the Envoy's Longhorn Powerful Holy build. This is a really fun one. Being able to actually blow bubbles and make it work is something that you can do in Elden Ring because the Envoy's Longhorn is that good. It does stance damage, it does insane amounts of holy damage, and the weapon skill on it scales again with your Faith stat. So if you get high Faith, and then you can throw in the Envoy's Crown for another 15%, Shard of Alexander, start stacking the damage, and you're going to get insane holy damage out of this. By the way, it's pure holy damage. even when it's resisted decently, the Envoy's Longhorn is still quite good. As long as they're not 80% or more holy resistance like the final boss, as long as they don't have that 80% threshold, if they're around 40% in terms of holy resistance, you're still going to be able to chew through their HP because it's that level of power. It has that ridiculous amount of power. It's incredibly overpowered. The Envoy's Longhorn is a lot of fun. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Envoy's Longhorn plus 10. We had the Giant Seal, but any seal will do. Envoy's Crown on for that extra 15% damage. That's important too. Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Sacred Scorpion Charm, Dragon Crest, preferably the Great Shield Talisman. Then we have the Holy Tier. You can throw in something like the Faith Tier as well. Let's get into stats for this one. So on this one, it's much like the Blasphemous Blade and Black Flame Tornado at the beginning. The weapon skill itself is entirely your Fate stat. Get that as high as possible and you're going to get an insane amount of damage out of the Envoy's Longhorn. If this isn't a weapon that you've used yet, this is something you definitely got to use if you're a Faith build. It's really enjoyable and it does a lot of damage too. Definitely consider blowing bubbles because in Elden Ring, blowing bubbles is actually quite powerful. Next up is the Black Knife and Black Blade combination build. These stacked, by the way, I'm going to talk about that here. This is a really powerful one in terms of Holy and Faith. So the weapon skill on the Black Knife is almost entirely scaling with your Faith stat, which means you can throw in different incantations as well. And interestingly enough, the Black Blade's percentage damage, you only get one debuff, but the percentage damage between the two will stack, giving you an awesome combination that can just absolutely shred through bosses' HP with ease between the percentage damage and the initial contact hits. Black Knife is something you should always consider because for the majority of bosses in the game, especially larger targets because they seem to take more damage, especially if they have high HP pools from the percentage damage, these two in combination together can take on a lot of the bosses in the game with ease. You get the range out of them too. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Black Knife plus 10. We had the Tree Seal because it scales good with Faith. We have Malachite's Armor set on, Shard of Alexander, Sacred Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, Dragon Crest, preferably the Great Shield, and then obviously again here we're going to have that Holy Tier or the Faith or Defense tier you can throw in too, and then we're going to get into stats here. Again, high Faith. So as far as the actual stats here go, Faith is what you mainly want to invest in, as I mentioned, but everything else is really up to you. You can get a lot of poise and a lot of armor in a build like this because the Black Knife's really lightweight. We're using a weightless seal, and you can get a lot of damage out of basically just not having a lot of weight in general. So that's a plus too, so you can get some decent armor with decent poise, good amount of vigor as well, powerful build. Next up is my favorite holy build in the game, and that's the Crucible Knight build with Ordovis Greatsword. Ordovis Greatsword's weapon skill does a ridiculous amount of posture and physical damage. It's about 80% physical damage, by the way, for this one, so it's kind of secondary a Faith build, but even so, it does scale with Faith and then Strength as your main stat. It actually has an A in Strength, but the weapon skill is the real big benefit here because of the amount of poise damage it does and the damage it does in general. It combines for a very powerful build. Ordovis Greatsword is also incredibly fun to use too, so it's something you can enjoy trying out simply for the fact that the Ash of War weapon skill, or whatever you want to call it, is really cool to look at as far as aesthetically looking, and then it's also something where you can just slam down, as I mentioned, and get good damage and good posture damage. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have Ordovis Greatsword plus 10. Any seal will do. We have the Crucible Knight set on. We have the Shard of Alexander, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. We have the Godfrey icon because you can charge it and it is charged. Ritual Swords Talisman, and you can use the Holy Tier, something like the Faith or Defense tier as we've mentioned with many of these. It's very, very similar as far as that goes. Now for stats, your main stat is Strength, your secondary stat is Faith. So the main thing here is to go for 60 Strength and then 40 Faith because you have that A scaling in Strength, so you want to take advantage of the fact that the weapon has fairly good Strength scaling and then go secondary in Faith, and you're going to get a lot of damage out of the weapon itself and then the weapon skill, which is again something really cool and really powerful. And next up we have the Magma Blades. Again, another favorite and an incredible amount of fire damage with these two blades. So the Magma Blades give you a couple different options, but primarily speaking, they are a strength weapon. However, the weapon skill, if you're going to spam the weapon skill, it scales almost entirely with your Faith stats. So if you want to go for the minimum amounts on the weapon and then high Faith, you can get a lot out of the Ash of War on this, and it's incredibly powerful, and it's something where you can just invest mainly in one stat aside from the minimums and get a great return on the weapon skill. You're going to enjoy the Magma Blades, although admittingly the farm is pretty terrible for it. It does take a while to get these. There's no doubt that 0.5 or 1% drop rate or whatever it is a little bit brutal. You do get it at Volcano Manor, and the farm, again, as I mentioned, is something that's it's a little bit to get through. I think it took me 4 hours to get to, but they're powerful, they're worth it, and they're unique Somber Faith weapons. By the way, all of these builds will be in the description below. I'm going to try to timestamp everything too to make it a little bit easier. And this basically sums up the Faith week. I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end here, where we did all Faith builds, and it was really nice changing it up from like the meta stuff and just kind of enjoying everything. It was pretty fun. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have 2 Magma Blades. We have dual giant seals as well, because you can get a double boost on the incantations there. And then we had the Black Dumpling for a little extra damage, Shard of Alexander, Godfrey Icon, Ritual Swords Talisman, Fire Scorpion Charm, and the Fire Tier. The reason I had the Godfrey icon, by the way, you can swap it out for Dragon Crest, was because I was mixing in different incantations with this build. That full build will be in the description below, but again here you're going to go high faith because, as I mentioned, the weapon skill is pretty much all faith as far as this build goes, and everything else as far as the minimum on the weapons. If you're going to use it for the physical portion, though, it is very much a strength weapon. Yeah, the Magma Blades is something you definitely want to check out, and it's something where after you farm it is absolutely worth it because they're that powerful. I hope this summed up the entire Faith week and helped you guys out as far as picking the best Faith builds in Elden Ring on 1.09. These are all incredibly powerful, and to boot, they're going to be really enjoyable to use too. You should definitely check these out. Definitely be sure to check out the Discord too. There's like 400 people in there now. It's an awesome growing Elden Ring community. And if you're not subbed and you love overpowered PvE builds, be sure to check out all the awesome builds that are on my channel. There's like an entire library there now. Thanks for watching, and as always, I will catch you guys there.